Korean mafia boss saw a racist nurse abandon his pregnant black wife in labor. What he did will shock you. 1:47 a.m. Rain slid down the glass of Swedish Medical Center's labor ward in Seattle's First Hill neighborhood, each drop catching the amber glow of the city that never quite sleeps. Inside room 347, Barbara Nolan gripped the bed rail as a contraction faded, the kind that steals your breath and leaves you hollow. She waited for the relief that should come with the pain's retreat. Instead, she felt something worse. Silence. No footsteps in the hallway, no reassuring voice, no hand on her shoulder. The door opened, not with urgency, but with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had all the time in the world. The nurse entered, badge-reading J. Morrison, 15 years of service, and her eyes swept over Barbara with something that wasn't quite disgust but was certainly not compassion. Her movements were economical, checking the monitor, adjusting nothing, writing on the chart with unnecessary slowness. Barbara's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Is everything okay with the baby?" The nurse didn't look up. "Vitals are stable." "Could I get some water? My mouth is." "You're on restricted fluids." The words were correct. The tone was not. "I'll be back." She left. The door didn't quite close. It hung open just enough to let in the fluorescent light from the hallway, but not enough to feel like an invitation. Barbara heard the lock click a moment later from the outside. She told herself it was protocol. She told herself she was imagining things, but her hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the pain. Across the city in Bellevue, in a penthouse that overlooked the rain-slicked streets and the dark expanse of Lake Washington, Soren Shin was awake. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, phone in hand, watching the city lights blur in the storm. Barbara's last text had come at 1:15 a.m. "Going in now. Everything's fine. Love you." He'd wanted to be there. She'd insisted he handle the meeting first, the one that couldn't be postponed, the one that involved men who didn't appreciate delays. Now the meeting was over and something in his chest felt wrong. Not panic. Soren Shin didn't panic, but his instincts, honed by years of reading rooms, reading threats, reading the spaces between what people said and what they meant, those instincts were whispering. He tried calling. It went to voicemail. He told himself she was resting, told himself the hospital had rules about phones, told himself he'd hear from her soon. But he didn't leave the window, and he didn't put the phone down. Before we begin, please take a moment to support this channel by clicking the like, share, and subscribe button so you can keep enjoying awesome stories like this. Thank you. The contractions came in waves now, each one building higher than the last. Barbara had been in labor for 6 hours, 3 at home, 3 here in this room that smelled of antiseptic and something else she couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or just the recycled air of a place where people came to experience the most vulnerable moments of their lives. She'd chosen Swedish Medical Center because it was supposed to be the best. The brochures in the OBGYN's office had shown smiling faces, state-of-the-art equipment, and promises of compassionate care. The hospital sat in one of Seattle's most affluent neighborhoods, serving everyone from tech executives to old money families from Queen Anne and Medina. If you couldn't be safe here, where could you be safe? But safety, Barbara was learning, was not a location. It was a decision people made about you. Nurse Morrison returned at 2:14. Barbara knew the exact time because she'd been watching the clock, counting the minutes between contractions, trying to remember her breathing exercises through the haze of exhaustion and mounting dread. "I need to use the bathroom," Barbara said. Morrison glanced at the monitor, then at Barbara, and something passed across her face, something that might have been satisfaction. "You should have gone before getting in the bed." "I didn't need to before." Barbara's voice was steady, but her heart was racing. "Please, it's urgent." Morrison sighed. one of those theatrical sighs meant to communicate burden. She helped Barbara out of bed with movements that were just rough enough to claim efficiency, just careless enough to deny intent. The IV line tangled. Morrison yanked it free without apology. In the bathroom, Barbara caught sight of herself in the mirror. Her bonnet had shifted in the struggle with contractions, and her hair, usually so carefully maintained, framed her face in wild curls. Her brown eyes were bloodshot. She looked terrified. She looked alone. When she emerged, Morrison was at the door, arms crossed. "Back in bed, now." "Could you please?" Barbara started, but another contraction hit, this one so fierce she had to grip the doorframe. She felt something shift inside her, something that made her gasp. Morrison didn't move to help. She waited, watching, until Barbara could breathe again. "Please," Barbara whispered. "Something feels wrong." First-time mothers always think something's wrong. Morrison's voice was clinical, textbook. "You're progressing normally. Get back in bed." Barbara climbed back onto the mattress, and Morrison reattached the monitors with movements that were just forceful enough to leave red marks on Barbara's swollen belly. As she worked, her words came out casual, conversational, like she was discussing the weather. "You know, this hospital has changed so much in the past few years. Used to be a certain standard of patient. Now," she trailed off meaningfully, her eyes flicking to Barbara's face, then away. "Well, we take everyone now." The words hung in the air like smoke. Barbara's throat closed. She wanted to say something, wanted to demand respect, demand care, demand basic human decency. But another contraction was building, and she needed this woman. Needed her to stay, to help, to do her job. So Barbara swallowed the anger and the hurt and the growing terror, and she said nothing. Morrison finished with the monitors and moved toward the door. Barbara watched her hand hover over the call button, the one that should have been within Barbara's reach, the one that was now somehow on the far side of the bed rail, just out of reach. "Try to rest," Morrison said. "I'll check on you in an hour." "An hour," the word escaped before Barbara could stop it. "The doctor said." "I know what the doctor said." Morrison's smile was thin. "But I'm the one who's here, and I'm telling you you're fine." The door closed. The lock clicked. Barbara was alone with her pain, her fear, and the growing certainty that she had been categorized, judged, and found wanting. Not because of anything she'd done, not because of any complication in her pregnancy, but because of something she couldn't change and shouldn't have to defend. The color of her skin. At 2:47 a.m., she tried the call button. It didn't work. She told herself it was broken. Told herself Morrison would realize and come back. Told herself this was still a hospital, still a place of healing, still somewhere she could trust. She was wrong on all counts. If this moment made you feel something, if you're wondering what a man like Soren Shin does when a line is crossed, subscribe now. This story only gets deeper. Like and share this video so others don't miss what comes next. At 3:12 a.m., another nurse walked past Barbara's room. Barbara could see her shadow through the gap beneath the door, could see her pause, as if hearing the sounds of someone in distress. Barbara had been calling out for 10 minutes, her voice growing hoarse, her dignity dissolving with each unanswered plea. "Please," Barbara called again. "Please, someone help me." The shadow shifted, stopped. Barbara's heart leapt with hope. Then the footsteps continued down the hall, faster now, like someone trying to outrun their own conscience. The contractions were coming every 3 minutes now, each one a tsunami that crashed through her body and left her gasping. The baby was coming. She could feel it, some primal knowledge that transcended medical training or reassurance. But there was no one there to catch her child. No one there to monitor for complications. No one there to care if she lived or died in this room where the walls were painted a soothing blue and the art on the walls depicted peaceful forests. She'd read about this, about Black maternal mortality rates, about how Black women were 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications, about how educated middle-class Black women exactly like her, still faced discrimination in healthcare settings. She'd read it all and she'd told herself it wouldn't happen to her. Not in Seattle, not in 2025, not in a hospital this prestigious. She'd been naive. At 3:31 a.m., the door opened again. Not Morrison this time, but a younger woman, Latina, perhaps early 30s, with tired eyes and scrubs that suggested she'd been on shift for too long. Her badge read C. Ray's, RN. I heard, she stopped, taking in Barbara's condition. The sheets soaked with sweat. The way Barbara was gripping the bed rails so hard her knuckles had gone pale. Oh my God, how long have you been like this? Hours, Barbara gasped. Please, the call button doesn't work, I need. Let me check your progress. Ray's moved quickly, professionally, and Barbara felt a surge of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Finally, someone who saw her as human. But then Ray's pager went off. She glanced at it, and something in her expression changed. Her hands, which had been reaching for the medical gloves, froze. Ray's looked at Barbara, then at the door, then back at Barbara. I need to. I'll send someone. Wait, please don't leave. I'll send someone, Ray's repeated, and there was something in her voice now. Not cruelty, worse, fear. She left, and Barbara understood in that moment that there were cameras in these rooms, that everything that was happening or not happening was being observed. That people knew, that people were choosing. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. In Bellevue, Soren's phone rang. Not Barbara. He would have recognized that ringtone immediately, would have answered before the first ring finished. This was Victor, his second in command. Boss, I tried calling the hospital. They're saying there's no patient by that name. Soren's hand tightened on the phone. What? Swedish Medical Center, First Hill. I told them Barbara Nolan admitted at 1:15. They claim they have no record. She checked in 3 hours ago. I have the text. I know. Victor's voice was careful. Something's wrong. Soren didn't respond immediately. He was thinking, calculating. Hospitals didn't lose patients. They didn't fail to have records. They certainly didn't refuse to confirm someone's presence to their spouse. This wasn't incompetence. This was intentional. Get the car, Soren said quietly. Now. He hung up and stood there for a moment, looking at his reflection in the window. In the glass, he could see the man he'd been trained to be: controlled, strategic, patient. But underneath that reflection was something else. Something that had been dormant since he'd met Barbara, since he'd learned what it meant to love someone more than you feared anything. That something was waking up. And it was very, very angry. But Soren Shin had not survived in his world by acting on anger. He'd survived by being smarter, colder, and more thorough than everyone else. By understanding that real power wasn't loud, it was inevitable. By knowing that the most devastating responses came not from explosion, but from precision. So he didn't rush. He got dressed, a dark suit, perfectly tailored. He knotted his tie with steady hands. He put on his watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than most people's cars, bought not for status but because it kept perfect time, and time was about to become very important. Then he made one phone call, not to the hospital, not to his lawyer, to someone else entirely, someone who owed him a favor, someone who worked in places where information flowed like water. I need camera access, Soren said. Swedish Medical Center, labor and delivery, every angle, and I need it now. The person on the other end didn't ask questions. They knew better. Soren ended the call and picked up his car keys. The drive from Bellevue to First Hill would take 17 minutes at this hour if he followed traffic laws. He wasn't going to follow traffic laws. 3:47 a.m. The Audi R8 cut through the rain like a blade, its engine purring as Soren navigated the near-empty streets. Past the darkened shops of downtown Bellevue, over the I-90 bridge where the lake stretched black and infinite below, through the arterial roads that fed into Seattle proper. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm. The city was asleep, dreaming its complicated dreams, unaware that something was shifting in its carefully maintained order. Soren's phone lit up on the passenger seat. Not a call, a file transfer. Encrypted, compressed, time-stamped. He pulled over on a side street, 3 blocks from the hospital, and opened it. The video files loaded in sequence. Camera 1, hallway outside room 347. Camera 2, nurse's station. Camera 3, room 347 interior. He watched. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a woman in labor, nurses coming and going. But Soren had spent 20 years reading behavior, understanding the language of what people didn't say. And as he watched Morrison's movements, her timing, the deliberate slowness of her responses, he began to understand. This wasn't neglect, this was punishment. There, Morrison's hand moving the call button just out of reach. There, the way she checked the door lock from the outside, ensuring it held. There, Ray's entering the room, receiving a page, and leaving with the expression of someone who'd just been warned. And there Barbara, his Barbara, alone, in pain, calling for help that wouldn't come. Soren watched all of it, every minute. When he finished, he sat in the car for exactly 30 seconds, rain drumming on the roof, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the phone's screen. Then he made 3 more calls. The first was to his lawyer, not the one who handled his business acquisitions, but the other one. The one who specialized in making problems disappear or making them very, very visible, depending on what was required. I need everything, Soren said. Employment history, disciplinary records, social media, financial records. Nurse Jennifer Morrison, Swedish Medical Center. I need it in 1 hour. The second call was to the hospital's board chairman. Not to the hospital itself, to the chairman's private cell phone, the number that wasn't supposed to be available to the public. Soren had acquired it 6 months ago, during a transaction involving real estate holdings and city council votes. He'd never planned to use it. Plans chain. The phone rang 4 times before a groggy voice answered. Who is this? My name is Soren Shin. You don't know me, but you're about to. I'm calling about Swedish Medical Center and a situation that's developing in your labor and delivery ward. You have approximately 12 minutes to get to the hospital before this becomes a very different kind of conversation. I don't appreciate being threatened at 4 in the... I'm not threatening you. I'm informing you. Room 347, Barbara Nolan. You'll want to review the security footage before the media does. 12 minutes. Soren hung up. The third call was to a journalist he knew, not personally, but by reputation. Sarah Chen from King 5 News, known for her investigative pieces on healthcare discrimination. She answered on the second ring, and he could hear the alertness in her voice, that particular quality of someone who'd trained themselves to wake immediately when opportunity called. I have a story for you, Soren said, but you need to be ready to move fast. Swedish Medical Center, labor and delivery. I'll send you files in 1 hour, but you need to be on location now if you want the live element. What kind of story? The kind that wins awards, the kind that ends careers, the kind that actually matters. There was a pause, then, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Soren ended the call and started the car. But he didn't drive to the hospital. Not yet. Instead, he drove to a 24-hour coffee shop on Capitol Hill, a place with harsh lighting and strong coffee and the kind of clientele that asked no questions. He ordered an Americano and sat at a corner table where he could see both exits. Then he waited. This was the part most people didn't understand about power. They thought it was about immediate action, about bursting through doors and making dramatic demands. But real power was about knowing when to move and when to let consequences build like pressure in a sealed container. It was about giving people just enough time to make their choices, to commit fully to their mistakes, so that when the reckoning came, there would be no ambiguity about who was at fault. Morrison was still in Barbara's room. Soren knew this because his phone continued to ping with updates from the security feed he was no longer watching, but that was being recorded, time-stamped, and stored in 3 separate encrypted locations. Every second of neglect, every moment of deliberate cruelty. Every choice that Morrison was making, believing herself protected by the system, by her 15 years of service, by the unspoken rules that had always shielded people like her when they harmed people like Barbara. She thought she was safe. She thought wrong. At 4:15 a.m., Soren's lawyer called back. "You're not going to believe what I found." "Yes, I will." 4:23 a.m. Barbara had stopped calling for help, not because the pain had lessened. If anything, it had transcended pain and become something else entirely, a force that was remaking her body from the inside out. But because she'd realized that her pleas were feeding something in Morrison, that every cry for help was being met not with assistance, but with that same thin smile, that same slow approach, that same careful, deniable cruelty. Morrison had returned at 4:00 a.m., exactly when she'd said she would, with the punctuality of someone establishing plausible deniability. "Still having contractions?" Morrison asked, as if Barbara might have somehow stopped being in labor. "The baby is coming, I can feel." "You'll know when the baby's actually coming. Right now, you're just uncomfortable." Morrison checked the monitors with movements that seemed designed to take as long as possible. "Your vitals are fine. Baby's vitals are fine. Everything's progressing normally." "I need the doctor, please." "The doctor is with another patient, a more urgent case." The words landed like stones. More urgent. As if Barbara's emergency, because this was an emergency, her body was screaming that this was an emergency, was somehow less valid, less worthy, less real. "Can I at least have some water?" Barbara's lips were cracked. Her mouth tasted like copper. "My IV." "Your IV is running exactly as prescribed." Morrison adjusted the drip rate, but Barbara couldn't see if she'd increased or decreased it. Probably decreased. Probably just enough to claim she was following protocol while ensuring maximum discomfort. "Please," Barbara whispered, and she hated the sound of her own voice, small, pleading, diminished. This wasn't who she was. She was Barbara Nolan, who'd graduated top of her class, who'd built a career in tech, who'd stood before boardrooms and commanded respect. But none of that mattered here. Here, she was just a body that someone had decided didn't deserve care. Morrison leaned in close enough that Barbara could smell her perfume, something floral and cloying. "You know," Morrison said quietly, "women have been giving birth for thousands of years without all this fuss, without epidurals, without monitors, without complaining every 5 minutes. Maybe you should try being a little more resilient." The word resilient hung in the air, loaded with implications. Code for, stop complaining. Code for, you're not that special. Code for, I don't see you as human enough to warrant my compassion. Barbara felt something break inside her, and it wasn't physical. It was the last thread of hope that this was all a misunderstanding, that Morrison was just having a bad day, that things would somehow get better if Barbara could just be cooperative enough, grateful enough, small enough. "I understand," Barbara heard herself say, and even as the words left her mouth, she wanted to grab them back. But she didn't, because she was trapped in this room, trapped in this hospital, trapped in this body that was betraying her with its vulnerability, trapped in a system that saw her as less than, and the only way out was through. Morrison straightened, satisfied. "Good, I'll be back to check on you in a bit." She left, the lock clicked. Barbara lay there in the semi-darkness, listening to the rain against the window, and for the first time in her life, she truly understood what it meant to be powerless. Not powerless in the abstract, political sense. Powerless in the immediate, visceral sense of being completely at the mercy of someone who had decided you didn't matter. And the worst part, the part that would haunt her even after this was over, was the doubt that was creeping in. The voice that whispered, "Maybe you are overreacting. Maybe this is normal. Maybe first-time mothers do make a fuss. Maybe you're being difficult. Maybe." No. Barbara pressed her hand against her belly, feeling her baby move beneath the stretched skin. She thought of Soren who loved her, who'd married her despite his family's objections, who'd stood with her against a world that didn't always want to see them together. Who'd promised her that their child would grow up safe, protected, loved. She held onto that thought like a lifeline. Stories like this matter. Like, share, and subscribe if you want to see how power really moves when silence breaks. The hospital hallway had been quiet for hours. That particular 4 a.m. quiet, when even the sickest patients seemed to find temporary rest, when the machinery of modern medicine hummed along with minimal human intervention. Nurse Morrison was at the station, filling out paperwork with the methodical attention of someone who knew that documentation was protection. Then the elevator dinged. The sound shouldn't have been remarkable. Elevators dinged all the time. But this one echoed differently in the empty corridor. And when the doors opened, something changed in the atmosphere. An administrator appeared. Not the usual overnight supervisor, but someone Morrison recognized from executive meetings. James Reeves, COO, who shouldn't have been in the building at this hour, who definitely shouldn't have been emerging from an elevator with his hair uncombed and his tie hastily knotted, who looked like someone who'd been woken up by a phone call that couldn't wait. Behind him came 2 other people Morrison didn't recognize, both in expensive suits, both moving with the kind of purpose that suggested lawyers, though no one had said the word yet. Reeves walked directly to the nurse's station. His eyes found Morrison immediately. "Room 347, he said. "I need access to all records, now." Morrison felt something cold settle in her stomach. "I'm the attending nurse for that patient. Is there a problem?" "The security footage. I need to see it immediately." "I don't have access to." "I wasn't asking you." Reeves was already moving to the computer, pulling up systems that required administrative override. One of the suited people, a woman with gray-streaked hair and the demeanor of someone who'd spent 30 years navigating hospital politics, leaned over his shoulder. Morrison watched them work, her hands suddenly clammy. Around her, the other nurses were watching too, emerging from rooms and supply closets like nocturnal animals sensing a predator. The hallway was filling with people, though no one was saying much, just watching, waiting. Reeves's face went pale as he watched the security footage, then red, then pale again. "Get the board chairman on the phone, now, and get Dr. Patel from obstetrics. I don't care if she's sleeping. Tell her." He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. "Tell her we have an emergency situation in labor and delivery." Morrison's throat closed. "The patient is stable, I checked." "You checked?" Reeves turned to her, and there was something terrifying in his expression. Not anger, worse, disgust. "You checked when you moved the call button, when you locked her in, when you ignored her for 40-minute stretches." "I was following standard protocol for—" "Don't," the word cut like a blade. "Don't say another word. You're being removed from patient care immediately, pending a full investigation." Morrison felt the floor tilt beneath her. Around her, the other nurses stepped back, a subtle physical distancing that spoke volumes. No one met her eyes. "I want my union rep," she said, and her voice came out higher than intended. "You'll get one after we ensure the patient is safe." Reeves gestured to one of the lawyers. "Escort Nurse Morrison to the break room. She's not to have contact with any patients, staff, or records until further notice." As Morrison was led away, she could hear phones ringing at the nurses' station. Multiple lines, all lit up. In the background, somewhere down the hall, a door opened, room 347, and voices spilled out, urgent medical terminology mixed with apologies. The hospital was waking up, but not from sleep. From the kind of institutional complacency that allowed people like Morrison to operate unchecked, year after year, protected by bureaucracy and the benefit of the doubt, and the silent complicity of people who saw but chose not to intervene. That complacency was ending, fast. Outside, in the parking lot, Sarah Chen from King 5 News climbed out of her van. With her was a cameraman and a producer, both looking alert despite the hour. They'd been briefed on the drive, enough to know this was significant, not enough to know how significant. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Check your email. Everything you need. Patient's permission attached. Story is yours if you move now." She opened her email, started downloading files, and as she watched the first minute of security footage, her eyes widened. "Get the camera ready," she told her crew. "We're going in." In the coffee shop on Capitol Hill, Soren Shin checked his watch. 4:47 a.m. He'd given the hospital 8 minutes to respond appropriately. They'd taken 12, close enough. He stood, left cash on the table, more than the coffee cost, because the barista looked like someone who could use it, and walked out into the rain. It was time. 4:52 a.m. The automatic doors of Swedish Medical Center's main entrance slid open for Soren Shin, and he walked through them like a man entering his own kingdom. Not rushed, not agitated, just purposeful, contained, moving with the kind of certainty that made people instinctively step aside. He was dressed impeccably despite the hour, the dark suit cut to perfection, Italian shoes clicking softly against the polished floor, hair wet from the rain, but somehow looking intentional rather than disheveled. Everything about his presentation said, "I belong here. I am someone you take seriously." The night receptionist looked up, prepared to direct him through the usual protocols. Visitor check-in, ID verification, restricted access to labor and delivery. But something in his eyes stopped her. "Room 347, Soren said. "Barbara Nolan." "I'll need to." "You'll take me there now." Not a request, not a threat, just a statement of fact. The receptionist reached for the phone, probably to call security. But then the elevator opened again, and James Reeves appeared, slightly out of breath. "Mr. Shin, I'm James Reeves, Chief Operating Officer. We've been expecting you. If you'll please follow me." They walked through corridors that Soren had memorized from the security footage, past the nurses' station where Morrison no longer sat, past the empty break room where she was now locked away, through the double doors marked labor and delivery, restricted access. "Mr. Shin, I want to apologize for—" "Don't," Soren's voice was quiet. "Don't apologize to me." They reached room 347. Through the window, Soren could see Barbara surrounded by people now. A doctor, 2 nurses, all moving with the urgent efficiency that should have been there hours ago. She was crying, but whether from relief or pain or the trauma of what she'd endured, he couldn't tell. "The baby?" Soren asked. "Being monitored closely. Dr. Patel says everything appears stable, but we're running additional tests to ensure." Soren opened the door. The activity in the room paused for just a moment, everyone turning to see who'd entered, assessing the new variable. Barbara's eyes found his, and something in her face broke open. Relief, love, and underneath it, shame, the kind of shame that comes from being forced to endure something no one should have to endure, from being reduced to something less than human. Soren crossed the room in 5 strides. He knelt beside the bed, conscious of the monitors, the IV lines, the medical equipment that surrounded her like a protective cage now, too late. He took her hand, and it was shaking. "I'm here," he said softly, just that. No dramatics, no promises of vengeance, just presence. Barbara's fingers tightened around his. "She wouldn't come. I kept calling and she—" "I know." He did know. He'd watched every minute of it. "I know everything." Dr. Patel approached carefully. "Mr. Shin, your wife is in active labor. The baby's vitals are good, but we need to—" "Do your job," Soren said, not unkindly. "I'll be right here." He stayed kneeling, his hand in Barbara's, while the medical team worked around them. And as he watched his wife breathe through another contraction, watched her face contort with pain that no one had cared enough to ease, watched her try to be brave even now, even after everything, he felt that cold, precise part of himself calculate exactly what needed to happen next. Not for him, for her, for every woman who'd ever been dismissed, neglected, or harmed in a place that promised safety. After several minutes, when Barbara was resting between contractions, Soren turned to Reeves, who was hovering near the doorway. "I need to speak with you outside." They stepped into the hallway. Soren closed the door carefully behind them. "The nurse," Soren said. "Jennifer Morrison, where is she?" "Break room. Suspended pending investigation. Mr. Shin, I want you to know that we take these allegations very seriously." "Allegations?" Soren's voice remained perfectly level. "I have 8 hours of security footage showing medical neglect, racial discrimination, and deliberate harm. Those aren't allegations. Those are facts." Reeves nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. We'll be conducting a full review." "No." Soren stepped closer, and though he didn't raise his voice, the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop. "You'll be doing more than that. You'll be terminating her immediately. You'll be filing reports with every regulatory body that governs your operations. You'll be reviewing every patient she's treated in the past 5 years and identifying patterns. And you'll be implementing new protocols to ensure this never happens again. We'll do everything in our power." "I'm not finished." Soren's eyes were dark, unreadable. "You'll also be issuing a public statement acknowledging what happened, not hiding behind confidentiality, not protecting your institution's reputation. Acknowledging, specifically, that a Black woman in your care was subjected to racist treatment by your staff, and you'll be compensating my wife appropriately." Reeves swallowed. "Mr. Shin, I understand you're upset, but there are legal processes." "I'm aware of legal processes. I'm also aware of media processes. There's a King 5 News crew in your parking lot right now. I can have them interview my wife about her experience, or I can have them interview your spokesperson about your institution's response. Which story do you think the public will remember?" The color drained from Reeves's face. "The crew is, how did you?" "It doesn't matter how. What matters is what you do in the next 10 minutes." Reeves looked at him, really looked at him, and seemed to see something that made him very, very nervous. Not the polished suit or the expensive watch. Something else. Something that suggested Soren Shin was not a man you wanted as an enemy. "I'll make the calls," Reeves said quietly. "Good." Soren turned back toward Barbara's room, then paused. "And James, if my wife or my child suffer any complications because of what happened tonight, we'll be having a very different conversation." He didn't wait for a response. If justice like this keeps you watching, subscribe. The end of this story doesn't comfort, it confronts. 7:23 a.m. The sun was rising over Seattle, painting the rain-soaked city in shades of gold and gray. The storm had passed, leaving behind that particular clarity that comes after turbulence, everything sharp-edged and somehow more real. Inside Swedish Medical Center, Jennifer Morrison sat in the break room under the fluorescent lights, still wearing her scrubs, her phone confiscated, her badge deactivated. Across from her sat HR Director Patricia Walsh and a hospital attorney she'd never met before. The union rep had arrived 20 minutes ago, looking harried and increasingly concerned. "You need to understand the severity of this situation," Walsh was saying. "We've reviewed the security footage, all 8 hours of it." Morrison's hands were clasped in her lap, knuckles white. "I was following standard protocols. First-time mothers often." "You moved the call button out of the patient's reach." "That's not. I was adjusting the bed." "You locked her in the room." "For her own safety, she was." "You withheld pain medication beyond the prescribed window. You denied her water. You delayed calling the attending physician for 3 hours despite signs of fetal distress." Each statement landed like a hammer blow. Morrison's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's your interpretation. Mine is different." Walsh slid a tablet across the table. On it, screenshots from Morrison's Facebook account. Posts from 3 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago. Subtle at first, complaints about changing demographics in the hospital. Then less subtle, shared articles about welfare mothers and system abuse. And finally, screenshots of private messages in a closed group, messages where Morrison had been more explicit about her views. "We've also been contacted by 7 former patients," Walsh continued. "All Black women, all reporting similar patterns of neglect during their time under your care. Some filed complaints that were not adequately investigated." The union rep leaned forward. "My client doesn't have to respond to these accusations without." "Your client is being terminated effective immediately," Walsh said. "We're also filing reports with the Washington State Nursing Commission, the Department of Health, and the Office for Civil Rights. This isn't a negotiation." Morrison's face went red. "You can't do this. I have 15 years of service. I have rights. I was just doing your job." The voice came from the doorway. Sarah Chen from King 5 stood there, camera crew behind her, red recording light on. "Is that what you were doing? Because I have footage that suggests otherwise." "You can't film in here," Morrison stood abruptly. "This is a private." "The hallway is public access, and you're about to become a public figure." Sarah's smile was sharp. "Tell me, Nurse Morrison, do you have a statement about why you locked a woman in labor in her room? Why you deliberately withheld medical care? Why you thought that was acceptable?" Morrison looked at the camera, then at Walsh, then at her union rep. And in that moment, she seemed to realize that this wasn't going to be quietly handled. This wasn't going to disappear into bureaucratic processes. This was going to be everywhere. I don't." She stumbled over the words, her face crumpling. "I never meant." "You never meant to get caught," Sarah said coldly. "But you did, and now everyone will know exactly who you are." 11:47 a.m. By midday, the story had exploded across Seattle's media landscape. King 5 led with it on their noon broadcast. The Seattle Times published a long-form article with the headline, "Pregnant Woman Alleges Racist Treatment at Prestigious Seattle Hospital." Social media picked it up, and within hours, #Swedish Medical Center and Justice for Barbara were trending. The footage was damning. Not all of it, the hospital's legal team had made sure of that, but enough. Enough to show Morrison's slow, deliberate movements. Enough to show Barbara calling for help. Enough to show other staff walking past. Enough to destroy any benefit of the doubt. Morrison's name was public now. Her photo, pulled from her social media before she could delete it, was circulating. Her address was being shared in Reddit threads. Her phone was ringing constantly with calls from numbers she didn't recognize, leaving voicemails that ranged from angry to threatening. She deleted her Facebook account, then her Instagram, then Twitter, but the internet doesn't forget and screenshots are forever. By 2:00 p.m., she'd received a certified letter from the Washington State Nursing Commission. An investigation had been opened. Her license was suspended pending review. By 3:30 p.m., her landlord called. "Several residents have complained. They've seen the news. I'm going to need you to consider relocating when your lease is up." By 5:00 p.m., her sister called. "Mom's crying. She's seen what they're saying about you online. Jennifer, what did you do?" Morrison sat in her apartment in Renton, curtains drawn, and tried to understand how everything had fallen apart so fast. This morning, she'd been a respected nurse with 15 years of experience. Now she was unemployed, publicly shamed, possibly facing criminal charges, and receiving death threats. And the worst part, the part that made her stomach churn, was that she couldn't escape the footage. It was everywhere. And watching it back, seeing herself through other eyes, she saw what she'd refused to see in the moment. She saw cruelty. She saw racism. She saw herself. 6:15 p.m. In room 347, Barbara held her daughter for the first time. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Perfect, beautiful, alive and healthy despite everything. They'd named her Hope, not because of what had happened, but in spite of it. Soren sat beside the bed, one hand resting gently on his daughter's head, the other holding Barbara's. The room was quiet now, peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of a newborn and the machines that monitored their vitals. "They say the stories everywhere," Barbara said softly. "People are angry." "Good. Is it?" She looked at him, exhausted, traumatized, but somehow still hopeful. "I don't want to be known for this. I don't want Hope to grow up and Google her birth and find." Find what? Find that her mother was strong enough to survive something that shouldn't happen. Find that her father made sure it was acknowledged and addressed. Soren's voice was gentle. "That's not a bad story, Barbara. It's not the story I wanted." "I know," he kissed her forehead, "but it's the one we have, and we'll make something meaningful from it." Barbara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her daughter in her arms, the weight of what she'd endured, the weight of what came next. They'd been talking about lawsuits, about reforms, about maybe starting a foundation to help other women who'd experienced similar treatment. It felt overwhelming, but it also felt necessary. "She's been fired," Barbara said. "The nurse, I heard Reeves telling you earlier." "Yes." "Is it wrong that I'm glad?" Soren looked at his wife, at his daughter, at this small family he'd built against all odds. "No," he said. "It's not wrong, it's just honest." 1 week later. Jennifer Morrison's termination had been just the beginning. The ripple effects spread through Swedish Medical Center like a seismic event, shaking loose all the institutional protections that had allowed her behavior to persist for years. The Washington State Nursing Commission's investigation was thorough and public. They reviewed Morrison's entire employment history, interviewed dozens of former patients, and discovered a pattern that stretched back over a decade. Not all her patients had been victims of neglect. She'd provided adequate care to many. But among Black patients, Indigenous patients, and other patients of color, a disturbing trend emerged. Longer response times to call buttons, fewer pain medication administrations, more dismissive language in medical notes, and most damningly, a complaint history that had been consistently downplayed or ignored by hospital administration. On day 8, the commission revoked Morrison's nursing license. Not suspended, revoked. The letter was formal, clinical, devastating. The evidence demonstrates a pattern of discriminatory behavior inconsistent with the ethical standards of nursing practice. Your actions endangered patient safety and violated fundamental principles of equitable care. Your license to practice nursing in the state of Washington is hereby permanently revoked. She could appeal. Her lawyer said they might be able to argue for a temporary revocation, a path toward reinstatement. But Morrison read the letter, read the word permanently, and understood that some doors, once closed, don't reopen. She'd spent 15 years building a career, gone in 8 days. But the consequences extended beyond Morrison herself. The hospital's board met in emergency session, and the meeting was not pleasant. How had Morrison operated unchecked for so long? Why had previous complaints, 7 of them, it turned out, been filed away without substantive investigation? Who else on staff had shown similar patterns? James Reeves, the COO who'd responded when Soren called, managed to keep his position. Barely. He'd acted decisively when it mattered, had cooperated fully with investigators, and had immediately implemented new protocols. But the chief of labor and delivery was not so lucky. She'd been Morrison's supervisor, had received 3 of those 7 complaints directly, and had consistently rated Morrison as satisfactory in performance reviews. When asked why she hadn't flagged the pattern, she'd said something about not wanting to rush to judgment and understanding both sides. She was asked to resign. When she refused, she was terminated. Patricia Walsh from HR survived, but her department was restructured entirely. New complaint procedures, mandatory bias training, not the perfunctory kind, but intensive, uncomfortable, consequence-laden training, anonymous reporting systems, patient advocates in every department. The hospital brought in external consultants who specialized in health equity. They reviewed every policy, every protocol, every aspect of care delivery through a lens of racial justice. Their report, 247 pages long, was published in full on the hospital's website. Swedish Medical Center's reputation took a significant hit. Patient satisfaction scores dropped. Some physicians began transferring their practices to other hospitals. Online reviews tanked. But something else happened too. Applications from nurses of color increased. Patients of color began reporting feeling heard, seen, treated with dignity. The new protocols were actually being followed because everyone knew what happened when they weren't. The system hadn't fixed itself out of moral clarity. It had fixed itself out of fear, but it had fixed itself nonetheless. 3 weeks later, Morrison sat in her apartment, boxes half-packed, and scrolled through job listings. Nursing was out, even if she got her license back someday. Who would hire her? Her name was permanently associated with the worst kind of medical negligence. She'd applied to retail positions, administrative work, anything that didn't require background checks too extensive, but even those were rejecting her. Not a good fit, they'd say, or simply never call back. Her savings were dwindling. Her unemployment claim was pending, but likely to be denied since she'd been terminated for cause. Her prospects were narrowing by the day. She thought about leaving Seattle, starting over somewhere else, but the story had gone national. Her face had been on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, each outlet using her as evidence of whatever narrative they wanted to push. She was famous in the worst possible way. Sometimes, late at night, she'd think about what she'd done. Not the action itself. She'd justified that to herself in so many ways, but the why. Why had she looked at Barbara Nolan and seen someone unworthy of care? Why had she let her own biases, her own resentments, her own twisted sense of justice override her professional duty? She had answers, but none of them felt adequate. None of them made it better. Her mother had stopped calling. Her sister sent brief, cold texts asking for updates. Her few friends had distanced themselves, as if racism might be contagious. She was alone, broke, unemployable, infamous. This was the second consequence, not just professional destruction, but social death. The complete collapse of the life she'd built, the identity she'd claimed, the future she'd planned. And unlike Barbara, who'd survived and built something new from the trauma, Morrison's story ended here. In a small apartment in Renton, surrounded by boxes she couldn't afford to move, scrolling through jobs she'd never get, living with the knowledge that she'd done this to herself. Some people get redemption arcs. Some people learn and grow and come back better. Morrison wasn't going to be one of them. 6 months later, Barbara stood by the window of their penthouse in Bellevue, Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. The baby had her father's dark hair and her mother's warm brown eyes, and she was perfect in the way that all Bobbies are perfect, full of possibility, untouched by the world's cruelty. Outside, Seattle glowed in the twilight. The Space Needle stood like a sentinel over the city, and beyond it, the waters of Puget Sound reflected the dying light. It was beautiful. It was home. It was the place where she'd almost died giving birth. She'd recovered physically. The body heals, but the mind remembers. She still had nightmares sometimes, dreams where she was back in room 347, alone, calling for help that wouldn't come. She'd wake gasping, and Soren would be there, steady and solid, reminding her that it was over, that she was safe, that Morrison was gone. But safe had a different meaning now. Safe was no longer a location or an institution. Safe was what you built through vigilance, through power, through refusing to accept that cruelty was normal. The Foundation's lawyers called again, Barbara said without turning from the window. They want to know if we're ready to start the public campaign. Soren looked up from his laptop, where he'd been reviewing proposals for the Barbara Nolan Maternal Justice Foundation. They'd funded it with a significant portion of his legitimate business assets, enough to make a real difference. Enough to ensure that other women wouldn't face what Barbara had faced. "Are you ready?" he asked. Barbara considered the question. Ready to be public about the worst night of her life. Ready to have her trauma become a cautionary tale, a rallying cry, a symbol. Ready to spend years fighting a system that had proven itself indifferent to her suffering until forced to care. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm going to do it anyway." Because that was the lesson she'd learned in room 347. That justice wasn't a given. That safety wasn't guaranteed. That the systems supposedly designed to protect you would abandon you the moment it became convenient. And that change only happened when someone forced it to happen. The settlement from Swedish Medical Center had been substantial, 8 figures, paid quietly to avoid further publicity. Most of it was going to the foundation. Some of it was going to other women who'd filed suits after Barbara's story broke, women who'd been too afraid or too poor or too exhausted to fight alone. Morrison was gone, her license revoked, her career destroyed, her name permanently tainted. It should have felt like victory, but Barbara looked at her daughter and felt only a profound sadness. "What do we tell her?" Barbara asked. "When she's old enough to ask, when she Googles her birthday and finds news articles." Soren came to stand beside her, wrapping one arm around her waist, the other gently touching Hope's head. "We tell her the truth, that the world isn't always fair, that some people carry hate in their hearts and let it poison their actions, that her mother was strong enough to survive, and that her father made sure there were consequences. And if she asks if it's better now, then we tell her it's better than it was, and that she has a responsibility to make it better still." Barbara leaned into him, feeling the weight of what they were building. The foundation would start with maternal health equity, training for medical staff, advocates for patients, emergency response systems for complaints. But it would expand. It had to, because the problem wasn't just one racist nurse. It was a system that enabled her, protected her, looked away until forced to look back. Across the city, in a smaller apartment in Renton, Jennifer Morrison sat alone. The eviction notice was final. She had 2 weeks. She'd sold most of her furniture already, trying to raise cash. Her car was next. She'd tried to disappear, deleted all social media, stopped going out, avoided anyone who might recognize her. But the internet was forever, and her face was forever attached to one of the most widely shared medical negligence stories in recent memory. She'd considered leaving Washington entirely. But where would she go? The story had gone national. Her name was burned into the collective consciousness as a symbol of everything wrong with healthcare, with racism, with the abuse of power. Sometimes she told herself she'd been misunderstood, that the footage didn't show everything, that she'd made mistakes but hadn't been malicious. But mostly, she sat in silence and understood that she'd destroyed herself, that whatever justifications she'd clung to were just that, justifications, that she'd looked at a woman in pain and decided that woman didn't deserve her care, her compassion, her basic humanity. And now she was living with the consequences. The funny thing about consequences, they don't care about remorse. They don't care if you've learned your lesson. They exist independent of repentance, unchanging and permanent. Morrison had learned that lesson too late. Back in Bellevue, as the city settled into night, Soren stood at the window long after Barbara had gone to bed. Hope was in his arms now, her small chest rising and falling with each breath, her face peaceful in sleep. He thought about that night 6 months ago, about the drive to the hospital, about the moment he'd seen Barbara surrounded by medical staff who'd arrived too late, about the cold calculation of how to respond, not with violence, not with threats, but with something more permanent. Power wasn't about dramatic gestures. It was about knowing which levers to pull, which phones to call, which consequences to arrange. It was about understanding that the system only responded when forced, and that forcing the system required resources, connections, and an absolute willingness to follow through. He'd followed through. Morrison was destroyed. The hospital was reformed, at least temporarily. The story had sparked conversations across the country about maternal health equity, about racism in medicine, about accountability. It should have felt like enough. But Soren looked at his sleeping daughter and knew it wasn't. Because the system had only changed because it was afraid of media attention, afraid of lawsuits, afraid of him. And fear was not the same as justice. Fear was just another form of power, and power without moral foundation was unstable, temporary, vulnerable to erosion. Real change required something else, something harder, something he and Barbara were going to spend years fighting for. Their daughter would grow up in a world still broken. But maybe, if they fought hard enough, she'd grow up in a world that was breaking differently. In a world where someone like Morrison couldn't operate unchecked for 15 years. In a world where someone like Barbara wouldn't have to wait for her husband to wield power on her behalf before receiving basic medical care. Maybe. Hope stirred in his arms, making a small sound, and Soren looked down at her perfect face. She would never know the details of that night. Barbara wanted to protect her from that. But she would grow up knowing that justice was something you fought for, not something you waited for. That safety was something. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe stories should expose what silence protects. More powerful stories are coming.